Now today is another folktale day and I love a good story. So you're going to be entertained and you're going to hear an old medieval story about the farmer and the haystack. And I do love a good story. Now the other day I was out in my workshop outside and I was working on some planks with my T-shaped axe going along the side, planing them with my axe. And a man came up to me and he said, I said, I've got a story to tell you, he says, of what's happened to my friend of mine. And I thought, oh great. So he sat down and he told me the story, and this is the story he told me. So some time ago, it was in the summertime, and they've been collecting hay in the fields. They got a good old scythe and siphoned the hay, and summer turned to autumn, and they had all these stacks of hay ready to go in a longhouse or an outbuilding. And of course they all got dried in the lovely late summer sun and the autumn sun, and they made a good old pile of them and tied them up with a rope so they could throw them on the back of a cart with a horse. And this old guy, who was a farmer, he was working all day, and he got thirsty, and he thought, oh, I've got a good old jug of mead here, so I'm going to have a good old bit of mead with a bit of water to quench my thirst. And he drank the whole thing. He was that thirsty, and it was a big container, and he felt very tired afterwards. So he thought to himself, oh, I'm going to have a lie down. Where shall I lie down, he thought. Shall I lie on the ground? Oh no, it's a bit muddy. I'm going to get my clothes all messy. Shall I go back home to my longhouse and have a lie down in my bed? Well, it was a good half a league away, and he thought to himself, I'm too tired for that. And then he realised he was stood next to a massive pile of hay, all stacked up and roped up, ready to be put back on a horse and cart, like I said. So he thought to himself, that's a good idea. I'm going to climb on top of this hay, and have a good old sleep for an hour. And of course, hay is so important in those times because you collected as much grass and hay as you could to feed your animals through the winter season. Or else your animals would starve, and you're going to be in a situation where you're going to have to butcher your animals, kill them and butcher them, and hang the meat up to dry in your longhouse with the smoke of the fire. It will smoke the meat and dry the meat. But of course, an animal alive is worth more than it is dead. So you had to collect a lot of hay and store it away. This is why a lot of farms had outbuildings to do this. Because let's face it, you don't want a massive pile of hay to be in your longhouse. But if you've got an outbuilding, you could leave it in there over the winter and then grab it when you want to feed your animals. That's great. And so he saw this massive pile of hay, and he managed to climb on top of it, and he had to lie down. Oh, a good old lie down, and he fell asleep and started snoring. But then something a bit strange happened, for a freak storm came over, and it started to rain and rain and rain, and it was also thundering. Perhaps the god Thor or Thunar to the Anglo-Saxons was trying to say something that day, but that's another story, and don't forget to subscribe as well. And so there he was, asleep, and he had that much mead, a big jug full. He didn't wake up with the rain, and he got very wet. But something even more strange happened, because the field he was on was very flat and was next to a good stream, or a beck in Norman, I do believe. And the field started to flood. The water kept on rising and rising from the stream because it was raining that heavy. I mean, very much like today, it rained so heavy today, I could hardly see the clouds in the distance. And I do love a good storm. But I wouldn't like to be in a longship between Iceland and Greenland in a storm. Would you? I'm sure not. So there he was, fast asleep, snoring his head off, and he couldn't wake up because he'd had that much mead. He was quite drunk at that moment. And let's face it, it's the one thing that knocks you out. It's a few pints of beer, in this case, a few pints of mead. And so it kept on raining and raining and raining. It would not stop. It was relentless. No matter, you could pray to all the gods. It wouldn't stop raining that day. But of course, the farmers were very happy and they would often praise Thor or Thunar and say, "Hail to Thunar and to Thor, for today it rains and our crops will be well watered." So again, it's not just Vikings and warriors that worship the god Thor. It was also farmers, because rain was so important to farmers, and especially these days when you go out in a field and you find that the field is bone dry. In fact, it's all cracking in the dirt. You can see cracks appearing everywhere. So water is so essential to farming and to the livelihood of farmers. And so it was raining that hard, the field began to flood. And it got to the point where the water reached the haystack. And it's been raining that hard, it raised by a good old foot. And the haystack started to float away. But again, our guy, our man, our farmer, the Saxon, or maybe a Viking, who knows? He could also be a Norman, boo, but never mind, that's enough of that. He didn't wake up, but yet the haystack was floating. And eventually it floated down to the stream, and the stream started to float it down and down the stream, down the valley. And eventually the stream merged with a river. Perhaps it was the River Derwent, I don't know, because there's no origin of where this story came from other than it's English, which is often the case with folk tales, because often in a folk tale they'll tell you and record the story, but they don't always record where they came from and the origin, and that's a bit of a shame, but never mind. So there was this old farmer, and no doubt he had a big grey beard, in his 40s, my age, which is quite old as a Viking and a Saxon in those times. You know, he's no doubt been to war and he's fought a few battles and he's survived them without being injured. And, you know, because let's face it, in those days everybody fought. If you was able to fight in a battle, then you'll be called upon by the local fjord and go to battle. So there he was, fast asleep. You know, he had a cloak on as well, so you'll no doubt wrapped up quite warm. And he was so drunk he didn't wake up with the rain. I think I would if I was on top of a haystack. And he was floating down, and he came to the river, and he started to float down the river. And of course, he floated on and on and on, until eventually he landed in a field, and the water receded, and the haystack was left in this field. And later on he woke up after another hour or two. He'd been asleep for quite a few hours. It was getting to be evening. The sun was coming down and setting. It was a good red sky at night. Always a good sign, so they say. And he woke up thinking, oh, wait a minute. He looked around. Oh, I don't recognise this place. Don't recognise those trees. This field's much larger than my field. And he thought, oh, where am I? He was very confused. He rubbed his eyes a few times, you know, out of disbelief. Again, you know, it was the same old place. You know, luckily he had a good old axe, just in case any bandits were close by or wild animals, but he was quite safe. And then in the distance he saw a man walking towards him, you know, in some nice posh clothing. And the man got closer, and the man on the haystack was waking up. He sat up and got off the haystack, and he says, by the gods, by the white Christ. No doubt if he was a Saxon, he'd probably be Christian. And later on, of course, the Vikings became Christians. He kind of said, oh, my good man. He said, where am I? He said, I don't recognise where I am. And the man who was coming towards him said, oh, I was standing outside my longhouse, and I saw your haystack floated into my field. And then I thought to myself, there's something a bit strange about this haystack. First of all, it's floating. Don't often see that every day. And then it looked like there was somebody asleep on it. So when it stopped raining, I thought I'd come down and see what's going on. And so here I am now talking to you. And he said, where am I? The man, the farmer that fell asleep on the haystack. And he said, well, you're at this place. And it turned out he was 20 leagues away, a good old 10, 15 miles from where he lived. Because most people in those times didn't travel far. So he's never been to this part of the land before. And he says, well, how strange is that? He says, I must have fell asleep after some mead on my haystack, because I was very, very tired. Because in those times you worked all the time from dawn to dusk and go back to bed and you start again. Very relentless but very hard work, because it made a difference in those times. The men were men and the women were women, and people were tough and strong. And unless you were very rich, you're going to have coarse hands, you're going to have big muscles for all the work you do. So he said, I don't understand how I got in. And the man explained how it'd been raining heavy and the flood must have carried the haystack with him on it down the stream and into the river and into the field. And the man on the haystack, said, well, how am I going to get my hay back? And the man who owned the field he landed in said, well, that's now my hay now because it's in my field. And said, you can go back home. And he said, I'll best leave now before it gets dark if I was you. And quite luckily, like I said, he had an axe, so he felt quite safe. And that was the end of the story. Thank you for watching, and please subscribe if you're new to the channel. It's goodbye from me with my good old axe. Goodbye!